All right, welcome. Good morning. My name is David Damshin. I'm so glad that you could join us today. This is our second quadrennial Utah Public Finance Symposium. Who was here in 2014 at the University of Utah? Right on. Okay. So that was really the inspiration for what we're doing today. I wanted to give you a little bit of context as to why we're here, and I'd like to take you back to the beginning of the story as I see it. We're in the midst of an incredible time of change in the municipal marketplace. It starts for me when I entered the state treasurer's office in 2009 at the beginning of the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. For context, I asked Brittany, our public information officer, to scare up some headlines from 2009 so we could remember, for those of you that were in public finance, banking, or related fields during that time, just to kind of evoke memories of the crisis that we all went through. These are a couple of headlines. Truckload of Americans caught sneaking into Mexico. Mafia lays off judges. Bank returns check, insufficient funds. Client asks bank, are we talking about me or you? Brittany, are these real headlines? Parents in Beverly Hills fire nannies and learn their children's names. McDonald's introduces the quarter ouncer. And my favorite, Dick Cheney takes stockbroker hunting. I didn't say they were real headlines. I just said they were headlines. My predecessor, Treasurer Richard Ellis, and I started our service in 2009 in the state treasurer's office, and it was indeed an extraordinary time. New to state government and weathering a financial crisis, I told Richard repeatedly, I said, listen, Richard, please tell me when things are once again normal, because I won't know what it looks like. And he actually never told me that things were back to normal, and he left the office 2.5 years ago. Truly, looking at where we are now, I sometimes think that every day, of course we're all familiar with the expression new normal, sometimes I think that every day is a new normal. Well, the events leading us into the Great Recession begat the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which was signed into law in July 2010. Dodd-Frank required the making of approximately 400 rules affecting banking, investments, and finance. Some of those directly affect the public municipal debt market, and we'll talk about a few of those today. I'm sure for those of you that joined us in 2014 when we staged what I think was the first ever Utah Public Finance Symposium, at that time we were dealing with the 1-2 punch of the SEC's Municipal Advisor Rule and the SEC's MCDC initiative taking center stage. We recognized the need for a forum in which we could bring Utah public finance professionals together for an intensive educational experience designed to promote best practices and ensure that we were all keeping up in a time of immense change. 2014 felt like an apex in regulatory activity, at least where the municipal bond market is concerned. Now, with MCDC in the rearview mirror and the MSRB's flurry of rulemaking activity winding down somewhat, if not entirely, my team felt it was a good time to come together again with the same purpose: to discuss best practices, to enhance our collective situational awareness, and to promote compliance in the areas of tax disclosure and financial reporting. Of course, change continues today. Issue price rules have been implemented this past year. The elimination by Congress of advance refundings might prompt issuers to more readily consider interest swaps, and LIBOR is set to be replaced by SOFR in a number of years. What are the implications and how will that transition be managed? Proposed amendments to Rule 15C212 are under consideration. The MSRB has issued a request for comment on Rule G17. Amendments to Rules G15 on confirmation and G30 on prices and commissions, requiring dealers to disclose their markups and markdowns on certain transactions in the confirmations they send to retail customers, just went into effect last month. Further, our market is marked by cross currents, dislocations in both supply and demand brought about by federal tax reform. Let's discuss some of these issues today. So again, welcome. The strength of the municipal market in Utah is extraordinary. Let's all work together to keep making it stronger. I'd like to give special thanks to my team, Kurt Slaw and Brittany Griffin. Especially, these two have done an extraordinary job planning this event and coordinating our panelists. I'm really excited about the lineup and the program that we have for you today. Thanks also to Reba Arndt, Kathy Wilkie, Ann Pedroza, and Mindy Grange with my office. Special thanks also to our financial sponsors without whom this event would not be possible. Chapman & Cutler, LLP, George K. Baum and Company, Lewis Young Robertson and Birmingham, U.S. Bank, Zions Public Finance, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs LLC, J.P. Morgan Securities LLC, Stifel, Veripath Global, Wells Fargo Securities, Cruz & Associates, Gilmore & Bell, KeyBank Capital Markets, Inc., RBC Capital Markets, Inc., and Zions Bank Corporate Trust. Is it possible that I forgot anyone? I hope not. Thank you all so much for your support. This would not happen if it weren't for the great financial institutions that serve us in our line of work coming together to support us today. I'd also like to thank the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, S&P Global, and My529 for their generous in-kind support through their subject matter expertise and professional training resources. Super excited to have Rita McLaughlin from the MSRB kick us off this morning. We're covering a lot of material today. If your questions aren't addressed during the sessions, we have a couple of mics set up. We want to make sure that you have opportunity to ask questions when we bring our panelists in. If we don't address your questions during the sessions, we have lunch, and we have this facility for about an hour after our formal program, and we encourage you to hang around and chat with our panelists and approach them with any questions that you haven't been able to address throughout the program. Lastly, please provide us with your feedback after today's symposium. The link to the survey is provided in the Google Drive folder referenced within your packets. We really need your feedback. And with that, I want to try to stay on schedule. I think we're only 1 minute behind, and we will start with our first session, Rita McLaughlin from the MSRB. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. How is everyone this morning? I have to say that I am delighted to be here in Utah. One, it's a lot less humid, and two, I got some extra sleep last night, so I want to thank you all, first and foremost, for having perfect weather, because it's about 90 plus in Washington and quite humid. And of course, having lots of light and sunshine hopefully will make this conversation that we're going to have this morning a little bit more pleasant. Regulations typically are not topics that people like to talk about currently in our market. So I am delighted to be here. As David mentioned, I'm Rita McLaughlin, the MSRB's Chief Education Officer. So this morning, in our next 40 minutes or so, and I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, I want to talk a bit about the MSRB to make sure you know who we are, what our roles and responsibilities are. I want to actually focus also in talking about some of the key rules that are critical for issuers to understand about what it means when the MSRB is writing rules and regulations for the financial professionals that are providing you services, and that's specifically underwriters and broker-dealers with whom we regulate. I also want to have a conversation about disclosure and some disclosure considerations. One of the things is David mentioned that MCDC, I think for many have rejoiced that that moment has passed. But there are still moments and there are still actually considerations that we all must keep in mind as it relates to the municipal securities market and the obligations for when we are out in the bond market and close transactions. And then, of course, I'm going to just touch briefly on EMMA, because later this morning I'm also going to talk about some of the new features on EMMA, but there are a couple things I do want to point out. And then finally, I want to share a bit about the MSRB's resources that we've developed for all market participants, and to make sure that you are aware of the resources that we provide, which are non-commercial, non-partisan, but really about the facts of what it means to be in the municipal securities market. And so with that, I think for many of you may be aware that the MSRB was actually created by Congress in 1975 to actually regulate the municipal securities market. And created in 1975 to design that there be a board that would work with market participants, essentially in creating the self-regulatory model to make sure that there were market participants as well as the public engaged in writing rules for broker-dealers at the time. And then also understanding that the SEC also, as part of the consistency with the Exchange Act, also has the responsibility of providing oversight to the MSRB. We also ensure that in terms of our regulatory mandate and the development of rules and MSRB activities, that we actually use the diversity of the municipal market in terms of market participants, as well as all of those that are engaged in market activity, be that issuers and others in that process. So who are we? What's our mission? It's to promote a fair, transparent, and efficient municipal securities environment and municipal securities market. And that also, as part of our mission, is to protect, and I'd like to use in quotation marks, protect investors, state and local government issuers, other municipal entities, and that may be 529 plans, LGIPs, obligated persons, and the public interest as we fulfill our mission. And how do we do that? Namely, by writing rules. And that's for municipal securities dealers and municipal advisors. I want to emphasize and state this loud, broad, flashing lights, and we do not regulate issuers. We only regulate municipal advisors and underwriters. I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. And we also operate transparency systems, and that's to make sure that there's information available to all market participants about activities in the municipal securities market. And how do we do that? It's by operating several transparency systems, but the public transparency system of MyEMMA, which I'll talk a little bit about, where there are disclosure documents and data. And I always love to ask this question in a room of this size: how many people use MyEMMA? Okay, this makes me very happy. I am delighted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the new features, and I'll cut through some of the preliminaries on that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the MSRB's Education Center, where we have a whole host of multimedia information that's available in terms of podcasting, videos, fact sheets, documents. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the newer services the MSRB has also developed, which is MuniEdPro, our online e-learning system. Our board of directors. We have 21 members that are on our board of directors that are representative of the marketplace, including bank representatives, brokered non-municipal advisor representative, non-dealer municipal advisor representatives, that means municipal advisors only, security firm representatives, and then, of course, our board is made up of a majority of public members. And many of those public members have actually been CFOs, treasurers, and finance directors from all across the country that actually serve on the board for a term of 4 years and providing guidance in terms of oversight to the organization as the MSRB, but also fulfill a rulemaking responsibility in terms of amending and developing new rules for the marketplace. So now let's talk a little bit about MSRB rules. And I want to share a bit about the rules for you to consider that the MSRB has developed, or in the process of developing and amending, as the case may be, as it relates to who we are, what we do, and how we are ensuring that the market is continuing to function in a fair and transparent manner. I think, as many of you know, in 2010, when the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act went into effect, there were two significant changes that happened to the MSRB. Well, I'd say more than two significant changes, but the two I want to focus on, in fact, are that our mission was expanded to protect municipal entities and obligated persons, in addition to investors and the public interest. And this is actually unique from the SIR model, because in our research, we recognize that there has never been another entity that has such a responsibility and a charge to do that from a statutory perspective. And also, our jurisdiction was expanded to also regulate municipal advisors. Let's see what's going on. Okay, we're testing my technical skills this morning too. I like that. So, as I said in the start of our conversation, we don't regulate issuers. We don't want to, we have no interest in it. We do not want to substitute the judgment of issuers in their activities on a day-to-day basis. Our role is to regulate dealers that are underwriting and trading municipal securities, and importantly, to regulate municipal advisors that are providing municipal advisory services to state and local government and other entities. One of the things I think that's really important in that context is for you to understand the process that actually the MSRB undertakes, both from the board and staff perspective, when we are developing new rules. I know that many felt a bit overwhelmed with the development of the municipal advisor regime, and understanding that there was a deliberate, thoughtful process that was undertaken by the organization to ensure that we were developing rules that are consistent, developing rules that were actually going to address issues that have been presented in the marketplace, and to go through that process. That essentially means that the MSRB is actually putting out, an issue may be presented by the marketplace. In this case, Congress, in its wisdom, said that you now are required to regulate municipal advisors. And in doing so, that the organization had to develop this, had to follow the consistent regulatory regime that exists to make sure that we were developing draft rules and draft amendments to existing rules that might be applicable to municipal advisors, and then soliciting public comment. I want to share with you that public comment is essential to good, efficient, fair rulemaking. It would be fabulous, I would dare say, if every one of you, in terms of responding to when we have requests for comments out, it is, as an SRO, critical to, as a self-regulatory organization, for us to have municipal market participants provide us feedback and to give us guidance and information as it relates to what is happening in the marketplace, to make sure that the rules and the proposals that are put forward are actually addressing the issues that we seek to address. And in that process, once we receive the feedback from proposals, that is then evaluated by staff and the board. And that evaluation process may include that the proposed regulation is then tweaked. It may mean that we go back out for comment an additional time. There have been instances in which we have gone out for requests for comment on several different occasions on the same rulemaking until the board is satisfied that it is efficiently addressing the issues that are put forward. Following that process, then there is a rule filing that is put together and sent over to the SEC. As I mentioned, the SEC does have oversight and approves the MSRB rules. There may be several back and forth conversations and documents that go back and forth between the SEC and the MSRB until the SEC believes that the rulemaking is actually fulfills its statutory obligations. And then also in that process, the SEC puts out for comment the proposal and then takes comments from the public as well. So there are several opportunities for the public and for members of the municipal market community to actually provide feedback on proposed rulemaking. Understanding, once that process does happen, in which a rule is approved, it has the full force and effect of federal law. So understanding when the MSRB rules are violated, that in fact it is a breach of federal law as well. So I want to make sure that everyone had familiarity with the process. So when we begin to talk about the rules, to understanding what they are, how they relate, that there has been a long deliberative process in that. Understanding what some of the categories are. There are fair practice rules, uniform practices, market transparency, professional qualifications. Importantly, everyone who is a professional, a municipal market professional, be that on the underwriter or the municipal advisor side, has professional qualification obligations, and I'll speak more to that. And then we also have administrative and definitional rules. Our rule book is actually provided on MSRB.org and also is accompanied by various resources to support compliance as well as to interpretive guidance for specific rules. So I'd encourage you, if you have insomnia at any point or you want to understand more about sort of the rulemaking process, to be sure to go to MSRB.org and to actually review the rules. And why does this really matter? Because essentially what we're talking about is when you are, for the issuers in the room, how many issuers are here? May I see your hands? I'm going to make sure that you understand that most of my comments will be directed in terms of ensuring that you have a full understanding of how we relate to your activities. And so this is a graphic of, theoretically, the deal team. And as you'll see on this slide, you have you as an issuer are in green and the blue. And that we have our regulated entities, which are those that are municipal advisors and underwriters with whom we regulate. And then, of course, there are all these other professionals that support the activities of what it means to actually issue securities in the marketplace. I want you to know we don't regulate those people. We are only regulating the municipal advisors and the underwriters. And part of our role is to ensure that in this process, everyone understands their roles and their responsibilities as it relates to ensuring that your transaction goes as needed in terms of being sure that you can raise capital in the financial markets. As many of you may be aware, we have put in the baseline regulations for municipal advisors. And recognizing that these were, of course, mandated by Congress, we wanted to ensure that now that municipal advisors have a fiduciary obligation to issuers, that they are acting in the best interest with regard to their own financial state. And understanding that previously municipal advisors did not have a professional code of conduct. And so in our creating the regulatory regime for municipal advisors, it was really to put in place ensuring that for those financial advisors, municipal advisors that are providing information and advice to state and local government issuers, that they were properly qualified to be able to do so. So what does that really look like in terms of the standards of conduct? And I think many of you have probably heard us and talk about MSRB Rule G42, which is the core element of what it means for municipal advisors. And let me be specific to non-solicitor municipal advisors in terms of their obligations to fulfill their fiduciary duty to issuers. And that is essentially to make sure they're exercising a duty of care and a duty of loyalty. And as I mentioned, what does that mean? It is putting the issuer's interests first before their own. It is being sure that they're providing information and not having conflicts of interest and disclosing if there are any conflicts of interest. It's being sure that they are, as it relates to obligated persons, being that if person that's a conduit borrower or conduit issuer, that they are also exercising a duty of care from that perspective. You should also be aware that the MSRB is in the process of will be releasing in the coming weeks guidance as it relates to MSRB Rule G42 for the marketplace to address some of the challenges and issues that we've heard from market participants as it relates to municipal advisors understanding and being able to comply with Rule G42. But I want to share with you that this is one of the most critical rules that you should be aware of in terms of the obligations that municipal advisors have to their issuer clients, and specifically as it means to document the relationship with the municipal advisor, to provide information related to that's accurately and correct as it relates to providing information with in RFPs, and also in terms of following standards related to the recommendation process. As I mentioned, for many of you will be aware that the role of the municipal advisor in having this fiduciary obligation runs a whole host of activities in terms of the overall scope that municipal advisors may fulfill depending on the issuer's needs and obligations. One of the things to also keep in mind that's happened over the course of since Dodd-Frank, which has now been over the course of the last 8 years, is really in the definition of the rules of the road. As I mentioned, municipal advisors now have a fiduciary duty to their issuer clients. Underwriters have an arm's length relationship. And I always like to describe Rule G17, which is also applicable to municipal advisors in terms of a fair dealing standard. It is the great don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal rule. And that's often how I describe it, that this is actually really the foundation of what it means for municipal market professionals to fulfill their obligations and services. And that's providing a duty of fair dealing. That is to all parties that they're engaged in. For the underwriters, it's providing fair pricing. It's also for underwriters making sure that they're respecting the issuer's priority of orders. If you are an issuer and you have a retail order period and you establish certain designation policies, it's part of the fair dealing obligation of the underwriter to ensure that they are following your direction. It is your transaction. And it's also, as part of that obligation, ensuring that from the other side, underwriters have a unique position and that they are also serving investors and issuers at the same time. But that arm's length relationship essentially means that as an underwriter, they're not there necessarily to serve your best interest. And that in a commercial transaction, that they may be putting their own interest forward. And that's in part in serving the interest of the investors as well. But they have the fair dealing obligation in terms of doing so. And so it becomes really important that underwriters also fulfill their requirements in providing official statements and other critical information and disclosure information to investors in that process. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the critical rules for you to be sure to be aware of and to be thinking about as it relates to the underwriting process, and understanding who your financial professionals are, and understanding as well their obligations and requirements from a regulatory perspective. We've heard from many market participants that some of the individuals that they provide services for are not aware and familiar with what obligations and requirements that they have to deal with. And so here on this screen, I've actually sort of laid out, I would describe this as a broad brush of some of the requirements that municipal advisors and dealers and underwriters have to comply with. As I mentioned, everyone has the obligation to be professionally qualified. So municipal advisors, as many of you may be aware, are now required to take and pass a Series 50 exam. Previously, prior to Dodd-Frank, municipal advisors did not have to be qualified. However, underwriters have always had a requirement obligation under MSRB rules in terms of fulfilling professional obligation standards. As I mentioned, both municipal advisors and underwriters have a fair dealing obligation for their clients. Core standards of conduct, as I mentioned, for G42. Very critical that this is the core rule in which municipal advisors are operating and providing services to clients in the marketplace. And then, of course, gifts and gratuities, pay to play, are all conflicts of interest rules. And this is to ensure both municipal advisors and underwriters and dealers in their activities of engaging in market practices or engaging issuers are aware of the conflicts of interest. Gifts and gratuities provides for limitations as it relates to gifts that can be given as it relates to providing for issuer clients and others. G37 in terms of political contributions. It is important to know that in terms of the pay to play, that once upon a time in our market, there may be some who will remember that political contributions were made to secure business. This is actually to prevent that process and not to interfere with the individuals to exercise their right to vote, but also ensuring that money does not interfere necessarily in that process as it relates to being able to secure municipal securities business or municipal advisory business. Also, in terms of from the dealer perspective, primary offering practices. So Rule G11 actually I think is important for market participants to be aware of. And this is actually, as I mentioned, in terms of the priority of orders process, ensuring that if an issuer has a retail order period or is engaged in that retail order period, that the underwriters are actually following the obligations of the issuer related to that and providing information to the entire syndicate, as well as fulfilling the obligations of honoring the issuer's wishes as it relates to bond allotments and keeping the issuer informed in the process. Also ensuring that in terms of the primary offering, that there are rules that actually dictate the provision of the disclosure information. And that is in terms of developing the official statement and ensuring that information is made available to investors and to the public. I want to just briefly mention that the MSRB just recently was approved amendments and a new advertising rule for municipal advisors. These new rules actually will be going into effect in February. And what they've done is to create consistency in terms of content standards, to understand what constitutes an advertisement, and to make sure that the municipal market professionals are providing information and acknowledging what is information that is of promotional nature, versus information that is meant to be providing educational documents for their municipal professionals. One of the things I also do want to point out is in terms of investor and municipal advisory client educational and protection information. For many of you issuers, at various points during the year, you should be receiving information disclosure from your financial professionals, from your municipal advisor, in terms of making sure that you have access and understanding of the complaint process and their obligations to you in providing municipal advisory services. And so this is a high-level overview. I would encourage you to go to MSRB.org to learn more specifically about these rules. Importantly, we actually have an education center where we've actually developed documents to go into greater detail on how many of these rules actually are applicable to both regulated entities, as well as support the issuers in their process of entering transactions. As I mentioned, municipal advisors and underwriters are required to be registered. And so if you want to see who's registered, who's actually fulfilled their obligations of having the Series 50, you can actually go to MSRB.org and you can check out municipal finance professionals, and you can see a full list of who is registered on the MSRB's website, as well as being registered by the SEC. So understanding municipal advisors also are required to be registered both with the MSRB and the SEC to be providing services. And so with that, let me switch gears a little bit and talk about disclosure considerations. Because we've talked about the roles and responsibilities of municipal advisors and underwriters and their obligations in the marketplace for transactions. But I want to shift a little bit and talk about sort of getting a larger context in terms of the framework of why this conversation about disclosure has been so significant in our market. And importantly, why, to give a little bit of background of like why this is actually really kind of matters. There are two major acts that you should be aware of. That's the 33 Act and the 34 Act. Importantly, when we talk about the 33 Act, it regulates the offer and sale of securities unless the securities are exempt from registration. And what that means is that, as many of you may already know, that for municipal securities, they are exempt from registration. State and local governments are sovereign entities and not required to register. However, under the 33 Act, although municipal securities are exempt from registration and prospectus delivery that is applicable to the 33 Act, it does not mean, and that means that municipal advisors don't have to file an offering document like corporations or other entities. And also that means that municipal entities don't have a registration requirement. However, what it does mean is that the regulation framework for disclosure was really created under the 34 Act. And that essentially means that there is a requirement for anti-fraud provisions in both the 33 and the 34 Act that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, that you should actually be aware of why disclosure is so critical to our marketplace. So the anti-fraud rule 10b-5, which essentially was established under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and prohibits fraudulent, inaccurate, or misleading information and disclosure to investors as the omission of material information. And I know the omission of material, what's material, is frequently has been a question that has been raised in our marketplace and has yet to be defined. And there is a great deal of case law that has spoken to materiality. And so, of course, today I will not speak on that. And I highly recommend that for those of you who have questions on that, to definitely talk to your counsels, your bond counsel or disclosure counsel in those efforts. However, 10b-5 provisions are designed to really prevent fraud. And that's in terms of being sure that investors, when they're buying municipal securities, that they are protected, that they know what they are purchasing and that they know that what they are buying. And related to that is 15C212. And I know that there's been a great deal of conversation in our marketplace over the last several years about 15C212. But I think there are a couple important distinctions as it relates to in the primary market, and that's the provision of the official statement and, of course, an advance refunding documents, and understanding that underwriters are required under 15C212 in a new issue to provide that information to the public. That also means in terms of from the secondary market perspective that the underwriter has to ensure that the issuer has actually provided annual financial statements or operating disclosures and event notices in its fulfillment of their continuing disclosure agreement. And these are obligations that underwriters have when they are issuing securities in the marketplace. Now, there's also the voluntary disclosure obligations that issuers may take on to provide additional information to the market and to investors as it relates to monthly or quarterly information, if they have changes in accounting standards, additional rating agency or investor presentations, or information about bank loans. I think many of you are aware that the SEC is currently under deliberations as it relates to amendments 215C212 and is examining providing additional requirements for the disclosure of bank loans or other financial activities of issuers. It has been shared by the SEC that in the coming months, those amendments will be released to the public with anticipation that information will then go into effect as a requirement at some set effective date. Many of you are probably aware of this, but there are 14 requirements as it relates to event disclosures. I always like to point out, because I think sometimes these are, everyone, not everyone, but many people probably are aware that if you're not going to be able to make your debt service payment, you do need to alert the market. But there's I think, good news information. Like if you are about to engage in a defeasance, that's information that should be disclosed to the marketplace. If you have bond calls, you're calling bonds, or you're going to do a tender offer, that is information that has to be disclosed to the market. If you have a ratings upgrade or a ratings change, and it's not always negative, that also needs to be disclosed to the marketplace. I think these are important things to make sure that these 14 events are required under 15C212, and of course may be expanding, but that you are fulfilling your obligations as it relates to honoring these 14 obligations. Importantly, the MSRB has a whole series of fact sheets that act on msrb.org in the Education Center that describes in greater detail these various event disclosures, and also provides a checklist for you in the event you want to make sure that you know what the 14 obligations are. So for the issuers in the room, how many of you remember filing or signing your continuing disclosure agreement? I always love asking this question. I remember you're sitting at the deal table, there are all these documents, and you sign in that whole series of documents, there was that one called a continuing disclosure agreement. It's actually a specimen that's provided in the back of your official statement. Importantly, know what's in your continuing disclosure agreement, all of them. Many times over the years, your predecessor, you may have many predecessors that had executed continuing disclosure agreements, and it's very important to make sure that you are aware of what is the timing of your annual financials that's consistent with all of your outstanding bond transactions. Also in terms of the reports, the types of events, the types of data that were actually required for each issue of bonds that has to be provided as part of your continuing disclosure. As I mentioned, in many cases, there'll be appendices as part of the exhibits in your official statement. So be sure that you are familiar with those. They can vary from issue to issue, but if having that familiarity at the end of the day will support your making sure that you're in compliance with your continuing disclosure obligations going forward. So when we began this conversation and talking about disclosure, it becomes really important to understand why it's so important. It's really for not just in terms of you as an issuer in the marketplace, but also in terms of our overall market and what it means for state and local governments to have access to the capital markets. And that is by providing information and having transparency, it builds investor confidence and builds the ability for those that are interested in supporting their communities to understand that when they make that investment, that they actually can find out information about what the projects are going to be used for. It's critical, I think, as many of us in the national dialogue has been in terms of supporting the development of capital and infrastructure development. It's part of accountability and public trust. And so when we can be sure that we are fulfilling our obligations to provide continuing disclosure information, that makes a huge difference in terms of our market being healthy, fair, and efficient. I think many of you, how many people have actually read the SEC's report from 2012? Parts of it. So I would suggest for all municipal market participants, this actually is a bit of a seminal document about who we are and where we've come from and where our market is going. And to make sure that at some point you have an opportunity, and it's not terribly long, but just long enough if you haven't had enough sleep, to understand the critical provisions about the SEC's perspective on our marketplace. And recognizing a great deal of the activity that has transpired in our market in the course of the last 8 years, the blueprint was in the SEC report. And so I would encourage you to make sure that you have a working understanding as it relates to the recommendations related to enhancing market structure, improving disclosure practices, and also ensuring regulatory efficiency. So I always like to share this and remind people to make sure that you take a look at this. As there have been changes at the SEC, there clearly have been additional conversations and new conversations, as I mentioned, in terms of looking at activities related to disclosure. But I would encourage you to take a moment as your summer beach reading, as the case may be, to be sure to take a look at the report. And it becomes really important in terms of context, understanding that MCDC in part was something mentioned about the challenges of disclosure in our marketplace. And I think as many of you may be aware that there were many issuers across the country, both at the state level, from school districts to large issuers to development authorities, that were found in violation of anti-fraud rules. And there were charges, there were fines, there were bans on business. There are now requirements in terms of developing policies and procedures and going through a continuing disclosure review process. Recognizing that in the event that there are failures in terms of disclosure, that they now have requirements that for 5 years, they have to acknowledge that failure in their offering documents. And that even applies in some instances after it has been cured. It is critical to recognize that in providing information related to continuing disclosure, keeping your continuing disclosure obligations updated is really essential to ensuring that we have fairness and efficiency in the marketplace. Investors want to know. And in terms of being able to provide that information is quite critical. And recognizing that there are consequences. Theoretically, everyone should have been doing this in the marketplace. And we recognize that things happen, but it's now come to pass that this is now something that is front and center. So that was the harsh news. And so now I've got some sunny news I want to share with you. And that's about Emma. And Emma turned 10 years old this year. And I mean, how many people remember the world of municipal finance before Emma? I do. I remember as a young associate having to spend hours upon hours trying to track down official statements in some sundry places and partial statements and trying to build a debt paint. And because this was life before Emma, which means there were many nights and days of no sleep trying to do that. But now we have Emma, and Emma's 10 years old. And for our $3.8 trillion marketplace, now you can find fair, free, public information. And that's essentially for all municipal securities in our marketplace. And so this is what's available on Emma. Emma has, I think many of you may be aware, official statements, event notices. We even have 529 savings plan and ABLE plan disclosures, advance refunding documents. You can also find political contributions, ratings. We now have ratings for all 4 rating agencies. And I will talk a little bit more about this, but now we've actually developed features in terms of yield curves and the new issue calendar. You can find out what's coming to market or what's in the market. And of course, trade prices and yields. So there's a wealth of information available on the Emma system. We actually receive over 1,000 documents a month. And recognizing that we actually receive about 35,000 trade reports every day, recognizing that underwriters have a requirement that within 15 minutes of every transaction, they have to report it to the Emma system. And so if you have not recently, I loved when I saw all the hands up about EMMA and understanding that information is available. And so part of what we've created is, I mentioned, the new issue calendar and economic calendar, where you can go and find out what's coming to market, what's available both in terms of competitive transactions and negotiated transactions. And also knowing what are the economic indicators that are going to be released and that are available. We've now created also and continue to enhance our market statistics section that allows you to understand many of the trends that are happening in our marketplace. The EMMA homepage. And in my presentation later this afternoon, I'm going to go into a great deal of detail about this. But just to give you a quick overview here, we've actually reconstituted the EMMA homepage so that as you are a frequent user or new to EMMA, that you are able to navigate what it means to find information. And so as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we've actually created tabs that are called Learn, Evaluate, and Monitor. And in Learn, you can actually watch videos in terms of what information you can find on EMMA. Under Evaluate, you can actually look at the various types of information in terms of your security specifically. And under Monitor, if you want to set up a MyEMMA account such that you can actually trade and you can actually track trades and other information related to particular securities, or you as an issuer, you're able to do that on the new EMMA, the new really designed EMMA homepage. And importantly, we recognize that not everybody knows their QSIP 9 or their QSIP 6 for a particular security, or even for their own securities. And so we've actually moved to the issuer browser page, known as the issuer homepage, which uses the map navigation function. And this has actually proved to be most beneficial for people to be able to drill down and find out information that is useful to them. And one of the things that is important about the Browse Issuer page, not only is it more intuitive in terms of the overall navigation, but it also allows you to be able to go in and find out particular information related to an issuer. And of course, it's no accident for the state of Utah. As you can see, the information is presented here where you can actually find out what pages have been customized in the state of Utah. You can actually look at in terms of other educational resources that would support your understanding, in addition to being able to see additional resources related to understanding EMMA and understanding the bonds that have been issued by the state of Utah. Another feature I do want to point out that we recognize that was important in doing enhancements to the EMMA system was making it a lot more user-friendly, not just in terms of its navigation and intuitive, but recognizing that being able to actually see the page. There's a lot of information. So we've now actually, as you can see at the very top of the screen on the right side, you can now blow up the page to be as large as 120%. Also, we did color features for those that may actually have a color, seeing various colors or have colorblind issues, to be able to see the screen in and of itself without additional assistance. So we wanted to make sure that we were making it intuitive, that we're making it easier to use, and that we were clearly recognizing the importance of making it accessible to all market participants. One of the things I do want to point out for those of you who have not customized your issuer homepage, and that actually recognizing customizing the issuer homepage means that you get to determine and make sure that the naming convention that's being used is the naming convention that you wish to have used, making sure that you have a contact that is the contact that you want for your organization that investors can reach out to or can call. It can also put links onto the page that make sure that investors or others that want to find out additional information about you as an issuer know exactly where to go. We've had many issuers all across the country, both at the state level, as well as many of smaller issuer organizations from small school districts and townships to also customize their issuer homepage. And so the advantages are that it's one-stop shopping to provide investors with information. And for those who may not have the technology resources to build your own investor webpage or investor site, this actually provides you the opportunity to be able to do that. And so how do you do that? The first is to create an organizational account. And by creating an organizational account, that provides you to establish an administrator so that if you have any staffing changes or any other in terms of who's responsible for providing information, that is centralized, and you can provide multiple individuals to be able to have access and providing information on your securities to the investing public. You should also be aware that the MSRB has resources that are in fact available at our call center to help walk you through that process, which is relatively simple and straightforward. We want to make sure that people's data and information is protected, and so there is a verification process that also is required. And here on this slide actually is a checklist of those documents that need to be provided. And once they've been provided and validated, it allows you to be able to go in to customize your issuer homepage, and to make sure that your naming convention, your contact, or who that you need them to be to make sure investors know who you are and what information is important to them as well. Another resource that the MSRB has created, which you can actually set up and when you have an organizational account, is reminders. And as we talked about continuing disclosure, this is a service that allows you to put as many as 50 individuals to make sure that you know when your continuing disclosures are due. And you can set different timelines by which you actually, in your working group, is receiving notices to make sure that you are not missing the deadlines and the requirements as it relates to your fulfilling your continuing disclosure obligations. So if you do not have email reminders, I would encourage you to be sure to sign up for this free service as well. MyEMMA Alerts. As I mentioned, in part of the enhancements that we have done with Emma is actually providing easier access to MyEMMA Alerts. And this actually provides you a way to make sure that you are receiving information about newly filed disclosures, or if there are particular documents and information that you would like to receive. And so you actually receive alert when there are particular changes or information that is provided on your issue or particular securities. This is also a free service that's offered by the MSRB, and going onto the Emma system, you can set up MyEMMA accounts as well. For those of you who use Emma frequently, you probably are aware that we provide the real-time and historical trade data. And we've developed processes and tools on Emma that allow you to actually compare and contrast securities and yields. We've developed graphing features that also allow you to actually look at the various trend lines for a particular security. We have not developed a plotting mechanism yet where you can plot it against a yield curve of any sort, but we do have the ability at this juncture where you can actually look at information over the time series. And so this is a tool I would encourage you to also utilize, in addition to our price discovery tool. And this allows you to compare and contrast securities, both in terms of rating category, pricing distinctions, as well as the issuance timeline, and to be able to plot that information across a grid, and being able to look at different time periods. So this allows you the opportunity to be able to get a better sense of where your securities are trading and to compare them to other issues outstanding. And so finally, I want to talk a bit about our educational resources. We have developed over the course of the last several years a fair amount of information on educational resources at the MSRB. And part of that process has really been about ensuring that people understand how the market works, what their regulatory obligations and responsibilities are. Because I think fundamentally there is an understanding that if everybody has the same information and all participants understand how the market is supposed to work, that we're able to achieve a greater level of efficiency. And the lack of the existence of asymmetry of information in the marketplace is something that clearly increases inefficiency. So we have been developing a whole set of tools and information, be that through the Education Center. Many of you may have attended at various points in time that we've developed webinars, we have compliance workshops on topics and issues and rulemaking that's happening in our market. And most recently, over the course of the last 20 months, we have launched MuniEdPro, which is our online municipal market education platform to provide courses that are eligible for CPE credit and continuing education credit to make sure that market participants are aware of their rules, their obligations related to rules, and understanding how the market works. Our Education Center, we have dedicated resources for issuers. and in terms of understanding the relationship to investors. As I mentioned, we have checklists, we have videos, we have podcasts, and that will allow you to understand more about the municipal market. And we've tried to make this in a user-friendly, easily digestible format in terms of providing these free resources. We encourage you to view them, to share them, and to know that they are available to you. We periodically add new information. You can also sign up to be on the alert list to know when we have added new resources to the Education Center. And MuniEdPro. This is, I mentioned, our online platform that we developed a little over 21 months ago, where the board recognized that there was a dearth of municipal market-specific continuing education materials. And that there was a need to make sure that for market professionals, there was information available that actually connected their activities to their rule obligations. And then also understanding that generally, many market participants have learned about how the market works, through on-the-job training. And that there was the need to make sure that there was complete and accurate information available for all market participants. And we actually have offered 2 free courses that are complimentary. One in terms of being an informed municipal bond issuer, where we've developed scenarios in which you actually have to do a financing for a water sewer treatment plant, as well as in building a convention center. And it takes you through a series of scenarios in terms of selecting your financing team, and also some of the questions that are required to consider when you're actually doing a financing. We've also developed a course for investors, so those that are interested in understanding, what's the opportunity or why should one purchase a municipal security. We've provided a free course for exploring municipal bonds for investors. And we have a whole series of courses that are also related to MSRB rules and activities, and are continuing to build the catalog in the coming months. So I would encourage you to go to MSRB.org to look at MuniEdPro for opportunities to learn more about our marketplace. And then finally, we want your calls, your emails, and your feedback. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation this morning, that it's really important as a self-regulatory organization that we're getting feedback from all of you. Our success and our ability to write rules that are effective in the marketplace really hinges on the feedback that we receive from all of you. So we encourage you to make sure that you sign up for our email updates on MSRB.org, to sign up for alerts that you know what's happening with us, to share by providing information at MSRB support if you've got questions, if you have concerns, to contact us. There's always a button that says contact us. We actually do mean it when we say it, and we actually do want to hear from you. And I always enjoy at the very end of every presentation to share. It makes it a little weird, but I think our world has changed a little bit. But you can also follow us on Twitter at msrb.org_news. And so please be sure to follow us on Twitter as well, and to continue to be in touch. We need you. We want your feedback, and we look forward to your thoughts about how we can make sure that our market functions fair and efficiently. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Rita. I wanted to point a couple things out for you just briefly. First of all, we have 180 in attendance here today. Thanks again for coming. Let's give a hand to one another for being here, committing the time to the health of our market in Utah. Thank you. We also have 40 people joining us via YouTube Live. So some of your colleagues might be sitting on a beach in the Bahamas. We will offer the video after the fact, so some of your colleagues may kick their feet up on the desk 3 weeks from now, close their office door, and watch the video of this event in its entirety, or not. But the opportunity is there whether they do or not. And so, again, I wanted to point out one other thing. If you look in your packet, there's a little business card that shows a Google Drive URL. All of the presentations from today are in that Google Drive folder that you'll have access to. So be aware of that. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kurt Slaw, who's going to moderate our next panel. and we will take it from there. Thanks.
Welcome. Can everybody hear me? Good? Well, welcome to the most exciting and important session you'll hear today on continuing disclosure. I'll be moderating today's session. As Dave mentioned, my name's Kirk Slaw. I'm the Deputy Treasurer in the State Treasurer's Office. It's good to see so many of you here today. I was convinced that most people had blocked this out on their calendar so that they'd have an excuse to be out of the office and go golfing. So it's good to see that you guys are actually here today. As you can see, I'm joined today by three expert bond attorneys. And before I introduce them, I just wanted to lay the groundwork for this session and also add a few comments. We would like to leave as much time as possible for your questions. So as you listen to the presentations that will be just brief, please be formulating some of your questions that you have. We feel it's most important to hear from you. As many of you are likely aware, the MCDC initiative concluded in 2016. During that period, the SEC issued cease and desist or fines to 72 underwriters and 71 issuers. Now that the MCDC period has passed, so has the period of leniency. So issuers are expected to have robust compliance programs that comport 100% with the SEC's mandates. Our STEAM panel is here today to help you with that and point you in the right direction and put you on the path towards 100% compliance. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, let me say that I'm thrilled with the expertise that we have on the panel today. Let's start with the guy in the middle here, Blake Wade, who many of you know really well. He's perhaps our most experienced bond attorney in Utah, works for Gilmore Bell, and is a partner of the state. We're glad to have him here today. He's joined on his left by Colleen Duncan, also with Gilmore Bell. She is our securities and continuing disclosure expert here today. So I like to refer to Tony here on the right and Colleen on the left as attorneys. These are the people that the attorneys call when they have questions. So if you think Blake and Ryan Yerke up there in the corner are wonky professionals, these take it to a whole new level. So so Tony here on the right, he's our tax compliance expert today. So all of your tax questions direct to Tony. All of your disclosure, securities compliance questions, Colleen. Anything specific to Utah or related to how to get to work without leaving a carbon footprint, biking, you can direct those to Blake. So. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to Colleen first to introduce her subject, and then Tony will follow that with some comments as well. So, Colleen?
Thanks, Kurt. I kind of like that. We're like nerds, you know? We're like a guy's guy. We're like nerds. So I kind of like that. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the State Treasurer's Office and Kurt and Brittany for their work and having me here today. We just talked a lot about the MCDC program, so I'm going to go through that fairly quickly just to kind of set the stage and talk about securities disclosure compliance and where we are today and the questions we get and what we're seeing sort of across our firm and marketplace. So if your issuer, your municipality has offered debt publicly via an official statement, you have a continuing disclosure undertaking. It's either a separate contract or it's in your bond indenture or bond resolution to provide ongoing continuing disclosure to the marketplace and to investors. There's two types of continuing disclosure. There's annual information, which is your audit and operating data that needs to be provided annually. And then there's event notices, the 14 events for which you need to file an event notice on EMMA within 10 business days. If you don't know where these are, if you have no idea what we're talking about, that's okay. You're in good company. Just call your lawyer or your financial advisor and ask them, where these are and what you need to do to get into compliance. Along with the annual obligations and the event notice obligations, there's a requirement that we all started paying much closer attention to after MCDC, that in your official statement you describe your 5-year basic historical compliance with your continuing disclosure undertakings. And that was the thrust basically of the MCDC program. For those of you who don't remember very much about it, congratulations, you probably didn't have to deal with it, but for those of you who did have to deal with it, it's seared into your brain. It was a self-reporting program essentially for anti-fraud violations of municipalities, nonprofit borrowers, and underwriters for material misstatements in official statements about the issuer's prior compliance with continuing disclosure undertakings. So the example that we gave over and over and over again when we were talking to our clients' boards was, if you had an official statement in 2012 that said, in the past 5 years, we've complied with our undertakings, and in fact, the issuer hadn't complied at all, the SEC said, all right, well, here's this program, you self-report to us and we'll go easy on you, meaning really no financial penalties. But if you don't self-report, and you should have, and you're the subject of an enforcement action after the fact, we're not going to go so easy on you. And that's true. The enforcement actions after MCDC on this topic imposed financial penalties on the issuer. So there were a lot of issuers and nonprofit borrowers who self-reported in 2014. We don't know how many self-reported. The market doesn't know. I don't think. I'm sure the SEC knows. But it was a pretty high number. And certainly increased the amount of time that those of us working on transactions, working disclosure documents, spend with this very, very narrow area of disclosure. All of the 71 municipalities who were required to enter into a cease and desist order under MCDC were required to adopt policies and procedures for continuing disclosure. And I think it's certainly a good practice. There's no doubt it's a best practice, and we'll talk probably a little bit more about policies and procedures. But it's only a best practice if you're following them and they work for your organization. So if you get a draft of compliance procedures or disclosure management policy, whatever you call it, I mean, it doesn't really matter. If you get a draft, you need to look at it and make sure that it works for your organization and your staff, that you're going to be able to follow the procedures in there and the policy in there, because what you don't want to do is adopt a policy or have a policy in place that you're not following. So it needs to be workable for you in your organization. If you're not planning to adopt formal written procedures, then you need to have a plan in place for compliance. Many clients remember that they need to file the audit because they have to send that 100 different places when the audit's complete. Send it to rating agencies, and they send it to the state and other places. We get it usually, but they don't remember that there's the operating data component, which is information, if it's a sewer bond issue, information about the sewer system, customers, things like that. So there's two components that you need to be thinking about annually. And then also throughout the course of the year, the enumerated events, the 14 events, so keep those in mind. So take a look at that list and be familiar with it. And if you have questions, obviously reach out to your lawyer. The MAs are also very familiar with these rules and can help with them. So that's sort of the background of where we are. So I'm happy to take any questions.
I think let's go to Tony next and let him introduce his subject, and then we'll go to questions.
My subject is the exciting world of post-issuance compliance, federal income tax rules. Now, hopefully people don't think this anymore, but there was a long time where people would do a bond issue, get to the closing, say, hey, I just went through all this pain and paid all this money to a bunch of lawyers and financial people to produce this big fat stack of documents, and now I got to the closing, we had a nice dinner, we're done, right? The answer to that is no. Certainly as far as the federal income tax rules are concerned, those are not just based on what you expected or thought you were going to do when you closed the bond issue. They're based on what you actually do for the entire life of the bond issue and any issue that refunds those bonds. 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Which for those of us of a certain age means at this point, every deal we do is around for the rest of our careers.
Can everybody in the back hear okay? Raise your hand if you can't hear.
Is the mic even on?
It is.
Okay.
Maybe just hold it a little closer.
I will
Tony.
put it closer to my mouth. There we go. I don't want to block the live stream though. I mean, is this one better? Oh, that does sound better. All right. Why do you need to worry about this stuff? I mean, basically, you want to be on top of post-issuance compliance to keep yourself out of trouble, and believe it or not, to make your life easier. Trouble, all right. So the IRS has and has had for a number of years a very active audit program. They audit tax-exempt bond issues, and when you get an audit letter, if you do, it's going to have 25 questions, more or less, asking for a whole bunch of detailed stuff, not just that bond transcript, but what have you been doing since you did the bond issue? And you want to be able to answer that, and you want to be able to answer it as easily as possible. I've seen perhaps more situations where there are other people asking about tax questions. There are, believe it or not, active whistleblowers who are in the business of looking at bond deals, getting Freedom of Information Act material, and if they think there's a problem, ratting you out to the IRS, because they'll get a percentage of any settlement. Community activists who couldn't care less about the tax rules, but know just enough about them to create problems. The press, I've seen a number of things beyond even the IRS. So what is it you need to pay attention to? Of course, there's a huge number of tax rules, but some of the big issues that you're typically going to run across. One is how you spend the money. I guess, first of all, spend the money. That may sound stupid. You're all working for people who are scraping for every dollar. You don't have money in your petty cash drawer to burn. But it's amazing the number of times that we get calls from people 5 years, 10 years after the bonds were issued and say, we got all this money left over. What should we do with it? Or you get to the time 10 years after you issued the bonds and you come along and you're going to do a refunding of the bond. And the first question is, what'd you spend the money on? Well, this is what we spent it on. And oh, by the way, here's this whole slug of money we haven't spent yet. Get it out the door, spend it on the projects that make sense, spend it on capital costs, keep track of what you're spending it on. So that's one. You need to avoid what's called private use of anything that you finance with your bond proceeds. You're only allowed de minimis private use, maybe 5%, 10% of the bond issue. A lot of details on how you get to that. Private use is basically any business use of the proceeds by anybody, or the assets you finance by anybody other than a state or local governmental entity. What does that mean? Well, okay, obviously for-profit corporations, partnerships, individuals doing trade or business use. But it also means the federal government, which does come up on occasion, and what comes up more often is it's not just for profits, it's not for profits, including 501c3 organizations create that private use, unless you've gone through the steps of actually doing your bond issue as a 501c3 bond issue, which for a typical municipal issuer you're not doing. So what is it that creates it? Selling the property is the obvious one, and that comes up with a lot of times. You know, parcel of land, whatever, we end up selling it. We lease some excess floors in this building we financed. That's private use. And the other one is service contracts. Food service, you name it. But if you enter into a contract with a private entity, a non-governmental entity that involves the use of any of your bond finance property, that's something you need to pay attention to and see if you're complying with the private use restrictions. That's a big one. Another one is there are a bunch of investment restrictions, and they're mostly about investments of your bond proceeds until you spend them. Yet another reason to spend your money and spend it quickly. There are prohibitions on, after a certain period of time, generally 3 years, what are called federal guarantee prohibitions. We have problems where people, or we've run across situations where people run across problems with that, with investing in bank accounts that are FDIC insured, federally insured, as well as certain other investments. There are also the fun and exciting world of arbitrage, which is, involves basically yield restriction on how you spend the money, and what's called arbitrage rebate. If you invest the money above your bond, at a yield above the yield on your bond issue, you got to pay over a bunch of money to the federal government, unless you do various exceptions. Last several years, that hasn't been a problem because you're issuing bonds at 3-4% and investing at, if you're lucky, 1%. We're seeing rates come up for investments now, so that's becoming more of a relevant consideration. So then the question is, all right, when do I do this? How do I do this? First of all, the key here is, from the beginning, talk to your bond counsel, okay? Your bond counsel is not your enemy. Even the tax lawyer is not your enemy. We're on your side. We're not on the IRS's side. Tell us what you're thinking about. Tell us what's going on. We'll figure out the best way to deal with it. We'll figure out whether you have an issue that needs to be dealt with. Post-issuance compliance starts, believe it or not, best before you issue your bonds. Think about what you're financing. Find out what the plans are, not just you and the finance department think's going to happen, but the people actually on the ground who are there and saying, oh yeah, we're going to buy that piece of land, but we might sell it to somebody in a couple of years. When a development opportunity comes along, you don't want to be financing that land. Best way to avoid a problem is just not to finance it in the first place. The other thing we run across all the time is you got to keep track of what you financed, and you got to keep track of it for the life of the bond issue or until its useful life expires. Can you finance things like 100 laptops and 200 office chairs? Sure, nothing wrong with that legally. Do you want to keep track of that stuff? Probably not. Go finance your building, finance big pieces of equipment that aren't going to go anywhere and are easy to track. We have some new rules, what are called floating equity. So when you put in your own money and bond proceeds into a project, we can define the project broadly and give us this money. We can move around the different components of it, so you're not going to have a private use problem. Again, that's all part of the planning process. Then after the bonds are issued, you got to continuously or at least regularly pay attention to how that property is used. Sometimes, all right, it's a school building, it's our main high school, not so difficult. Sometimes you finance a whole bunch of different stuff and it's much harder to keep track of. In any case, you want to keep track of that. The best time to find out after issuance about private use or some unexpected change in use is during the planning stage. So you can talk to your bond counsel and say, what's it going to take for us to be able to sell this piece of land? And you can think about, well, is that going to cost more than the value of selling the land? So you make the best financial decision up front. The second best time is, well, it's too late. We already signed the contract for selling that piece of land, but at least it's before we sold the piece of land. There are change in use rules that if you comply with, will save your bond issue from tax exemption. But they require action to be taken very quickly after the actual change in use occurs. So you want to know ahead of time. If you find out after the fact, and it's too late to take those change in use rules, you're talking to the IRS, you're paying the IRS money, not necessarily your most pleasant situation. There is a voluntary closing agreement program. You go to the IRS, you deal with it that way. Needless to say, the worst time to find out about it is when you get that audit letter from the IRS, and it's like, oh, gee, we sold that piece of land. There's where you really have a problem. So keep track of it. Document your compliance so that somebody can find it 15 years from now when you get that audit letter. You're required to keep records about all this stuff for the life of the bond issue and any refundings, plus 3 years. So, the normal record retention policies don't apply here. And finally, and maybe obviously, but nevertheless, if you get one of these audit letters, talk to your counsel, whether it's your own counsel, bond counsel, talk to somebody right away. Don't wait until the deadline's about to come up. Don't pass it around the office until you get somebody who's willing to actually read the thing. Talk to somebody so that you start dealing with it at the beginning.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Colleen. Yeah.
So, can you hear me up top? Okay. I think they've done a great job of teeing this up as to why this is important to us here in Utah, the folks that are here. Most of you don't spend all day, every day working on your bond issues. And so the key things are to figure out what it takes to comply in advance and be able to put those procedures in place so that you can sleep at night. You don't have to think about it. And then because this does come up, it comes up when you do your next bond issue, there'll be questions about how have you complied with your continuing disclosure. It's a lot easier to address that if you've been thinking about that since your last financing and keeping those covenants. Same with what Tony described with the tax side. We're seeing here in Utah more and more audit letters coming through. We just had one close out recently, and I'll tell you, the best thing you can be able to do is to send the IRS a package that says, here's the procedures we have that we've been able to document to show that we walk through the building annually, we go through a checklist to show that we still own it, we still do not have private use in it, this is where we spend our money. When you can send a package like that to the IRS, when you can document that from a disclosure standpoint, when you do your next issue, things sell through. And this, you may be not thinking about what the IRS's role in this, but this is a revenue generator for them. When, as Tony described, when they come out and they find a problem, their next response to you is, let's talk about a settlement agreement. That's IRS speak for you cutting us a check. So the best thing you can do is to think about this, the things that we'll talk about as you have your bonds closing, and put those procedures in place so you can just send that off to them and say, this is how we've completed, this is how we've complied. And so that's what we're really talking about when we talk about continuing compliance with bond covenants.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. That was a great background. Now we're going to enter the question period. So if you have a question, just stand up. Brittany and Reba. Is Reba around here? Okay. They have the mics, and they'll take you the mic for the questions. So we have a question up here. Brittany? I'll just ask one first while Brittany's taking the mic up there. Blake, you mentioned just now that you'd been through several audits. Tony, you mentioned some audits and some of the things that you feel are best practices. Are there some other best practices in record retention that you can share with the audience to ensure a smooth, clean audit every time?
Sure, I'll take a first stab, and then Colleen or Tony, if you want to just follow up. So in both cases, the key thing is that you maintain a bond file. You have some place where you can document what it is you've done. You could be the best at submitting information and complying with your covenants, but if you haven't documented that, and if you don't retain the documents, it's hard to demonstrate that in the future. And so whether it's demonstrating that you filed your continuing disclosure undertakings on time, because even Rita did a great job of describing Emma, and yet we found that there may be problems in terms of things linking to a QSIP number or something else. So if you've kept records of what you've done and you retain those in a bond file, then you can demonstrate that indeed you've complied with your covenants. But if the things that you do to make certain that you haven't had private use and you spent your money, if that's somehow just out there in space, trying to document it, it's very difficult to then show that when the auditors come around and they want to look at it.
Great.
Yeah, the two things post-issuance that are asked in probably 95 to 99% of the IRS audit letters. One, show us your investment records, show us your arbitrage rebate calculation, or tell us why you met an exception and didn't need to do it. The other is show us or tell us exactly how you spent the money, what you spent the bond proceeds on, and how that's been used. Any private use, any contracts, any leases. Again, going back to when the bonds were issued, this could be 10 years ago. Yeah, you want to be able to reach into a file and pull something out, not recreate it under the pressure of an IRS deadline when you're talking to, or you're somebody who's looking at, or somebody's looking at this who wasn't even around 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the same thing on the disclosure side. Is you want to be able to quickly pull your evidence of filing together, because as we all know, it takes a long time to go back and look at all of your obligations and look at every year and see what was required to be filed, and then was it timely filed, and to do that quickly it is critical. As part, like the IRS, as part of an enforcement action, I'm not an enforcement lawyer, but the SEC, I understand, is likely to also ask for policies and procedures and demonstrate how you've complied with those policies and procedures. And so if you have them in place and they come calling, you're going to need to have that information ready to go. But more likely, and from a practical standpoint, you want to have those ready when you do the next deal, because we're seeing a lot of outsourcing of compliance reviews to the underwriters. When they do their reviews in connection with the new offering, are outsourcing these reviews of your compliance to third parties. And those third parties are not as familiar with your organization, your debt, your continuing disclosure obligations, perhaps even your local economy and area as your investment banker is. And so there can be some issues with those. And so you want to have your information ready to go, so when those third-party reviews come in, you can make sure that they're accurate and that the resulting disclosure is accurate.
Thank you. I think there was a question up here.
If I can, I love interrupting you anyway. If I can just follow up, point out one thing, which I think is the point you were making is also true on the tax side, which is even if you never get an IRS audit, probably most bond issues you do are going to be refunded at some point, and you're going to have to make a whole bunch of certifications about the investments and what you've done with the bond proceeds and that property, and you're going to want to be able to just, again, pull that out of the file when you do the refunding, not recreate it 10, 15 years down the line.
I have two questions. First for Colleen. I'll ask them both, and then you can get to them. This is, are there any efforts that you know of to get the MSRB to give us some relief on the rating agency change, now that this is common knowledge in the market? Because we've got a lot of people who are having to spend time watching this on a very short time frame and then trying to get notices posted when the market already has all this information. That's the first question. The second question is for Tony and Blake, particularly on behalf of Utah school issuers and other general obligation issuers having to do with a situation where you might be getting a little more money in your debt service fund You're starting to build up a balance, and now the state treasurer's pool is returning enough money that in our low interest rate environment, that return may exceed the bond yield. Review the bona fide debt service fund compliance a little bit.
Like, I want to stand up and clap. That's a really good point, and I think a lot when the ratings, you're talking about an event notice for a rating change, right? And what happened over the past since the economic downturn 2008 2009 is that your underlying credit got a lot better than your insured rating. And so what happened is you've got your underlying credit being better, but you've got a downgrade from your insurer. Well, then your underlying credit is better, and why would you need to file an event notice for something like that? And we went through a lot of analysis like that. The proposal that's currently before the SEC is to add new events to the list of 14, and I know there has been discussion about rating changes and whether that needs to be something that issuers need to notice since it is publicly available. But I think if it's all right, if Rita wouldn't mind addressing that this afternoon, because I think a lot of it has to do with the capability of Emma, that information is there, but it's not necessarily, I don't know if it shows up to someone who's following those bonds immediately as a notice might. So I'm not technically very sophisticated, so I don't have that information. But from a materiality standpoint, there's a good argument to be made that failure to file an event notice for a rating change might not be material in every instance. It's certainly material in a lot of instances, but there's an argument to be made depending on all of the facts.
I think one of the things that this raises, and Rita mentioned this in her presentation, that Emma has some features to send you a reminder, or that some things may be posted automatically to your QSIP number so that they're showing up. As an issuer, when you sign the continuous disclosure undertaking, you're agreeing to make sure this stuff gets done. So there's somewhat of a danger in relying on someone else doing that. So the rating agencies in many cases are posting that. I think they're now required to send it, or they're doing that. The question will be whether the SEC will let us say, well, they've now taken that over, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. Because that is one of the toughest ones for an issuer, is that you may be getting, there may have been, the rating agencies from time to time will do a global look at ratings to see whether entities within certain categories are appropriately rated. So they may actually modify a rating, and you may be finding out about that later, the fact that there was some changes made. And so in some cases, they're better at making certain that gets out, and we'll have to see if the SEC will give us some leeway on that. For Dale's question, Tony, if you want to take a stab at that. This is a question for those of you that issue general obligation bonds. You levy a tax in advance every year, and because you have delinquencies, you have collections after the fact, you have changes in value, you can't dial that in exactly to what your debt service is, and yet state law would require you to put that in a debt service fund, and there are federal tax ramifications that result if too much money builds up in that account. And so this question relates to that specific case. So those of you that don't issue general obligation bonds, go ahead and keep watching the World Cup on your laptop, and Tony will address this, and we'll let you know when we come back to your question.
All right, Dale gets extra credit for using the phrase bona fide debt service fund, which is one of those fun arbitrage concepts. Basically, if your debt service fund or your bond fund, whatever you're putting the revenue in and using to pay P&I on your bonds, meets some rules, it can be a bona fide debt service fund. A bona fide debt service fund is not subject to arbitrage yield restriction or arbitrage rebate, generally subject to some exceptions. A bona fide debt service fund, one of the requirements is that it needs to be brought down to a de minimis balance, normally 1/12 of annual debt service, but a de minimis balance at least once a year. So if your money is coming in and it's going into a fund and you're not meeting those rules, you're going to have at least some portion of that is subject to yield restriction, because it's not going to be part of your bona fide debt service fund. And once that money's been sitting around for more than generally 13 months, it's subject to yield restriction. If your normal investment is above the bond yield at that point, you're not going to be able to make that normal investment without jumping through some hoops. There are various other investments you may be able to make, but it's supposed to be invested, that amount that isn't a bona fide debt service fund, it's supposed to be invested at a yield below the yield on the bond issue.
Yeah, go ahead, Brent.
Hi, Brad Walker with Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Typically, we'll sit on the underwriting side of a lot of these issues. And as we're drafting or assisting to draft in the official statement, the continuing disclosure section of the official statement with its disclosures on past non-compliance with the CDU, my question relates to, as an underwriter, we'll do our diligence and find foot faults or disclosure issues where they haven't complied and filed in a timely fashion. So we'll recommend that they disclose those items in that section. I've seen recently, in a couple of instances, pushback from the issuer and or their counsel on disclosing non-compliance. And my question is, from the legal community here, how would you advise your issuers in how they disclose those items? And is there any downside, or is there an aversion to fully disclosing foot faults in those items? From our perspective, it seems like full disclosure is much better, and we prefer that. But I've had some pushback on recent issues.
And that's understandable, right? Investment banking firms, underwriters after MCDC, they had to pay huge fines. So they're getting the attention of their internal compliance group. They have their full attention after a $500,000 fine from the SEC on this. And so individual bankers, it becomes very difficult for them to say, I know you. Yes, that's not material. We don't need to put it in. And we're seeing a lot of erring on the side of over disclosure, which is, every single foot fault, your term, or my term, immaterial disclosure needs to go in there. And that's really not, we kind of try to read the rule as it is, which is material non-compliance. And there are instances of immaterial non-compliance where issuers push back. I've got a AAA rated credit, as I understand you have quite a few of those around here too. But I have a AAA rated client who works with different banks. And so when you have different underwriters from time to time, they come in and they say, I want this disclosed, this foot fault. The finance director says no, because we didn't disclose that 6 months ago when we did our last deal, and we went through the analysis and we made a materiality judgment, and we're sticking with that, and we think it's accurate, and our lawyers will talk you through it. And so that's really the inconsistency there. Could put the issuer in a little bit of trouble, but I think for that particular client, it's more of, he's trying to keep everything straight. And so he's driving the bus on disclosure, which is really what we want the issuers to do, is to be driving the bus on disclosure. It's your offering document. We know after MCDC that, you can't point to anybody else as being responsible for the disclosure. And so taking ownership of that is a positive thing. But where things kind of fall in the middle, there's no real harm in disclosing something. If no one can, or the working group can't agree that it's immaterial, there's not really harm in disclosing something. I don't think, and you're the banker, not me, I don't think that it's going to impact your pricing. I have not heard that it would negatively impact execution of your sale. So there's no real harm from that perspective. Compliance, however, if you don't comply and you haven't done your continuing disclosure filings, underwriting firms are prohibited from underwriting your bond issue if they can't find a reasonable belief that you're going to comply going forward. And so if you haven't historically complied with your continuing disclosure obligations, it's difficult for them to find a belief that you'll comply going forward. And we have seen banks walk away from deals because they can't meet that standard. It's very unusual, but we have seen it.
So Brad, that is a really good question, and we deal with that all the time. I'm looking at Brad Patterson, my securities partner in the back corner, because I'll oftentimes go into him and say, is this really material? Because many of these things are, we missed a line, we missed a line in a table, or we got something that's presented a little bit different than it was initially. And so you're really only interested in material events. That's the name of the category. But I think for the bankers, it's usually, when in doubt, get it out. Just go ahead and put it in there. There's no harm. But there are issues. We wish the SEC would give us a little more guidance in terms of materiality standpoint. I'm looking at Rita. Maybe you can encourage them on that. But we can't ever get that, so in lack of that, we do oftentimes over-disclose, but I think there is really that materiality question today.
Great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No.
I just wondered what the latest regulatory environment is with regards to disclosure of private placements.
So Rita touched on this a little bit earlier. So there was a proposal in 2017, March 2017, from the SEC to expand that list of event notices to include really what they were after is bank placements and continuing covenant agreements that go along with those bank placements. So where you have an existing public set of bondholders who have senior debt, and then you borrow from a bank from that same revenue stream, and you enter into a set of covenants with the bank, and those senior bondholders don't know about it. That's really what they're that the marketplace expected they were going to be after, and what came out, I think those of us practitioners, was a lot broader than what was expected. And so everybody from the GFOA to the National Association of Bond Lawyers commented on that last year, and I think the SEC is still sort of considering it. The experts in our industry expect, I think, that it'll be revised somewhat to be a little less broad, because it would have required disclosure of any financial obligation, any material financial obligation. So like a lease. So anytime you sign a lease, which if you're a school district or a city is pretty much every day. So it would have been a little bit overbroad, I think, was the concern. So we expect that it will, probably be revised, but I mean, I don't have any information. I don't think there's anything publicly available on that front. Did that answer your question?
So Jim, that's a good question. Rita put that in the list of the voluntary category right now, and people are again trying to wrestle with this, as Colleen described, because what came out initially wasn't even close to what we would have thought it was. But for you as the issuers, this means you've got some debt that's been publicly offered. You've got to decide on MyEMMA, where you're filing continuing disclosure undertakings, and then you sell your bonds to one of the local banks here. And this is just something about how much of that we have to post. We're hoping to rein it into just that when you sell bonds, not something as Colleen described, that every time you have any other kind of a financial unrelated obligation, you got to put something on MyEMMA. That was never intended. We're hoping to get that dialed back.
Great. Kind of along those lines, as in the bond buyer, I was reading that the SEC's advisory committee had actually narrowed the scope of that. Do you have any comments on what ways they narrowed the scope of that rule change?
I don't know. I don't have that information. Was that recent?
That was just last week. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I apologize. Have they released how they're going to narrow it?
They've made recommendations in terms of being more specific as it relates to what will have to be required under the filings in terms of it being bank loans. I think, as you mentioned, that the language was quite broad, and this is looking more specifically to bank loan specific types of activities. And some of the conversation from that advisory committee meeting was in terms of setting a threshold in that what actually constitutes what would have to be filed.
So will we see a release from the SEC then with a proposed?
So that's, I mean, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, that is something that's anticipated that the market should be looking out for in the course of the coming weeks. They had not put a real timeline on it. The only timeline that they had actually been willing to commit to is that sometime before the end of the federal fiscal year, which is September 30th. But that is, remains to be seen.
Keep in mind for the issuers that when we think of bank loans, that includes that you sign a lease for some buses or something else. That is in that's in that same category as a bank loan. Or you decide you've got a relatively small bond issue that you want to do, and so you sell it to one of the local banks to avoid having to publicly offer it. That still is a bank loan. That's still in this category of what we'll need to report. So we'll be watching for that. We'll try to get some details out when it comes out.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Is there one more question? Okay. I'll ask one more then. We only have like 5 minutes, so keep that in mind. And the other side of this is lunch, so you don't want to keep people from their lunch. So. That's right. You mentioned the importance of the continuing disclosure undertaking. Rita mentioned the importance of the continuing disclosure undertaking. If I'm an issuer in this room, what kind of security can you give me to help me understand what you're going to help me do, how you're going to help me understand the continuing disclosure undertaking? Are you going to provide a checklist? How is it that you help your clients ensure that they can meet their continuing disclosure obligations 100%?
So I'll tee that up, and then Colleen can correct me where I go astray, because I'm sure I will. But as when we meet with issuers, as we're approaching the closing of your bonds, and particularly as we're structuring the official statement, looking at the information, we'll be putting in there the things that you'll need to update. And so we try to work with you to say, all right, we try to narrow the tables that are going to require updating, to say these are the things we think are critical, this is what you'll need to look at, and then we'll try to point out particularly the things you'll want to be aware of. How many days do you have after the end of your fiscal year to file it? What's the information you have to update? When's the first time you've got to do that? Because many times you might be issuing the bonds after the end of your fiscal year, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 months after that, but your audit hasn't come out for the prior fiscal year, so we'll say you got to go back and do it for that year that's already ended. You look at the information and what needs to be updated. So you don't update projections, generally speaking, you just put the historical information in. But Kurt, in answer to your question, we'll try to walk through that with the issuer. Now, one of the things that we always recommend is that you have put some procedures in place to make sure this happens, because you'll have staff changes during the course of the life of that bond issue. And so the same people aren't going to be there doing this in the future that were there. So when we've seen problems arise, and we've seen this with the very best issuers, all of you guys are the best issuers, but we've seen that with the most seasoned issuers, the most frequent issuers, we found that there were things that were missed. And generally speaking, it was because there wasn't a tickler system in place to say, yeah, this is when we got to start looking at this. And there wasn't a transition in place. Someone in accounting had always done this before, and he retired, and the ball wasn't handed off for this. And so those are the kinds of things to make certain that you've got the procedures in place. Think of this like you do for everything else in your organization. You've got a way that this stuff transitions over. Make sure this is put in that same category. So, Colleen, you want to clean up?
I actually don't have too much to add. I think, going into the new bond issue, the number one thing you can do for yourself is to make sure that you can meet that filing deadline and that you can get those operating data tables together. If they're coming from a third party, it might not be something you want to commit to provide within 180 days after the end of your fiscal year, because it can take some time to get information. So that's the only thing I'd add is just make sure that it's something that you can comply with and you're comfortable with. And if not, negotiate it. That's great. We're seeing a lot more of that.
And let your auditors know in advance that these are your deadlines so that they can do that as well.
All right, I have 30 seconds. I just want to say that what we've been talking about, what they've been talking about on compliance procedures, also important from a tax perspective, have post-issuance compliance procedures in writing. You know, that's great. But it does you no good unless there are procedures that you follow. So don't just, have bond counsel draft something for you and stick it in a drawer and forget about it. The same for tax, non-tax.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause.